Okay, folks, here we are looking at the American crossroads. These are the period of history you guys have been reading about, looking from around the 1860s, the last years of the Civil War, up to at least the 1890s, maybe a little bit beyond. And our purpose is we're going to take some notes, and you have a note organizer hopefully handy that you'll be able to prepare so that you could create two short answer responses for this presentation. You have a map right here of American Indians. You can take a look. We're focusing on the West. Here you see down here is where the Apache are. You've read about the Nez Perce, and the Nez Perce are found like up in this direction, right in this area up here. The Cheyenne and the Sioux are right in this region right here. And the Apache we're going to be talking about are in this area right here. So that gives you some perspective of what we're looking at. Let's see if we can just move ahead. Now, our task today is we're going to review the tragic consequences of America's advancing western frontier and apply the APE framework. We talked about this earlier in the year, writing APE, and it's in our introduction, and I'm going to take some time to kind of reinforce that too. When you write APE, basically what you need to do, you're writing an argument. When you argue, you have to have a point. What are you arguing about? You have to have evidence. What makes your argument valid? And then finally, you need to explain how does the evidence you provide support your argument. If we think of a very simple practical issue here, let's imagine you want to borrow the car. Well, that's coming up in a couple of years for some of you folks, but so you say, Dad, I'd like to borrow the car, which is your argument. Your argument, Dad, I should be able to borrow the car because I'm responsible. Well, where's your evidence? Well, Dad, I took care of the car. I washed and waxed it, and I vacuumed. Do you remember how I did that? And then, well, what does that have to do with using the car? Well, because you've shown responsibility, your explanation is my ability to show responsibility for taking care of the car shows I should have the right to be able to use it responsibly. So the evidence you use is going to be explained as the last part of your writing. When you learn how to write this way, you become a better critical thinker. You could analyze arguments better and say, okay, they're arguing this, but where's their evidence? That's the big issue. What is the weight of their evidence? And how does their evidence connect? What kind of logic connects the evidence to the argument? That's a skill we're going to be working with today. Now, here are the prompts, and you'll be writing essentially a paragraph, like 4 or 5 sentences for each of these. How was the American frontier a war zone between two very different societies? And the second one was, how did the American Indians resist the advancing frontier created by American settlers and its military? Okay, those are the two things you want to be able to answer in the course of today. Now, I want to break for a second and show you folks the rubric here. Now, the idea is when you write this, you need to have an argument. So your argument should be very clear, relevant, and provable, meaning that it's a statement that if I can't argue against you, then you don't have an argument. So, like, for example, Dad, I should be able to use the car. Has an obvious antithetical argument. No, you should not be allowed to use the car. So that's where your evidence and argument have to make you prevail. The second issue is you have to have evidence, and you want to use several pieces of evidence. The presentation here will give you a lot of evidence that you could use to support arguments relevant to the two prompts that you have. And then finally, the explanation, meaning that how does the evidence you provide connect to the argument that you make? The explanation should clearly connect and provide evidence to the provided evidence. It connects it. And if it does so clearly, then you've gotten it done. So the idea, again, is APE. You have an argument. P, you're providing evidence, which are the facts you get from the presentation. The explanation is yours. That's how you decide what is the logical connection between what evidence you're providing and what argument you have. Okay, so let's get back to this presentation here. So let's get started here. White settlement and the American Indian, the anatomy of the conflict. What were the guts of this conflict? We know that conflict with American Indians began with the first European settlement in North America, meaning the natives, as we talked about, were the original discoverers of America, 10,000 years of living on this land. And the settlements that would come from Europeans would challenge the American Indians, meaning that Europeans wanted right to the land. There was a couple of things that Europeans possessed that gave them the upper hand in this conflict for land. Guns, first off, that Europeans had superior technology. So when it wasn't just guns itself, but other forms of organization and technology allowed Europeans to kind of outmuscle the Indians. Second were germs. And this is interesting given the current concept we're in with the pandemic. But Europeans held certain immunities to germs that had long been part of Afro-Eurasia, Africa, Europe, and Asia. These were germs that people who were living in the Americas were unfamiliar with. They were isolated from, particularly smallpox. So when Americans came in contact with American Indians, the disease did an awful lot of work at clearing land, essentially by the tragedy of killing lots of American Indians. And the other issue is the organization of interdependent communities, that agriculture and industry and horses and all these things that Europeans brought with them gave them the upper hand. And starting well back before America was settled with the Incas and Aztecs, Europeans were able to kind of marginalize and subjugate or conquer the territory from these people. Europeans often saw the lands as not settled by Europeans and America's unsettled and frontiers as open land, meaning that the idea was this is land, it's free for the taking. But obviously, this frontier was land held by American Indians who had much different concepts about how to use it. You take a look at these two pictures and you see two very different ways, and this is the context here is the Great Plains. You see on the left, it's a ranch. So the idea of raising cattle and holding them together in a specific place and managing them in concentration rather than the buffalo, which of course is again a source of protein, but they were not herded or managed. They roamed and then they would be chased by American Indians who were in many cases pastoralists. They didn't use land in the same way. This difference in land use, of course, is going to be one of the genesis, the idea that Europeans sought to own land, put fences around it, to give specific claims to particular people who would economically benefit from the land in a way much different than the American Indians used the land. So you take a look at this. This is the shrinking frontier, and you can take a look at the map on top. Notice right here in 1492, of course, all of what is the United States was American Indian land. There are no reservations, no claim to it. By 1890, we could see the areas of some of the colonies, places where Americans had lived, but Indians were forced inland, further inland. By 1830, we talk about Indian removal, particularly of Florida and Georgia, and the West would be left pretty much for Indians. By 1860, we could see the growth of these colonies in the West. Okay, gotta move back up. And then eventually we could see that there really isn't much territory. By 1890, there isn't very much territory reserved for American Indians. So here we go. So infectious disease, the military force will push American Indians to the western parts of the Great Plains. And we didn't talk much about this. You might have looked at this last year, the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee Indian removal by President Jackson. But in 1851, there was a treaty of Fort Laramie, which is in eastern Wyoming. It guaranteed American Indians the right to the land of the Great Plains. Americans felt that land wasn't very desirable to begin with, and many of those areas would be reserved for American Indians, of course, until that land seemed to have more value. As more non-Indians move west, the United States government tries to acquire more land, which means to negotiate and renegotiate new territories, which would marginalize American Indians. Indians would receive some guarantees, but a guarantee held by without any kind of collateral was difficult to collect. These guarantees with the reservations would be theirs forever, and the promise that for 30 years they would get supplies of food. This is a process sometimes called concentration. Like you may be familiar with concentration camps, and we study World War II. The idea you take a population, like in Germany's case, it was Jews who lived throughout Europe, and you concentrate them in specific areas where they could be controlled. Now, of course, the concentration of American Indians bears some similarity to that because the idea of taking land from American Indians and focusing them and concentrating them in particular places where they could be controlled was part of America's Indian policy. Some government officials hoped that keeping American Indians on the reservation would force them to become farmers. And as farmers, they would abandon many of their traditional ways of life, which we saw earlier on was the issue of hunting and gathering. We talked about this in the bell ringer. They hoped to perhaps somewhere along the line kill the idea of the Indian way of life and make them into white-style settlers who would be happy with 160 acres and a farm that they could live on rather than live communally and pastorally. The Indian lands were seen as unsettled and available for agricultural development and settlement, but pastoral people need large places of territory as they follow the herds of animals. America formed what was called the United States government formed the BAI, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's still around today, and it was responsible for managing American Indian issues. And the BAI in the 19th century supported the idea of reservations, that is, territory that would be held in trust for American Indians communally as a group, not individually, and that land would be not open for settlement. But the areas that where the Indians were taken from would be open for vast areas of settlement. But the United States often would fail to uphold some of these treaties, that something along the line, the land that was set up for the reservations would seem to be too appealing to settlers. And as the settlers came and claimed the territory on the reservations were increasingly chiseled, increasingly shrunk as white settlers moved west more in great numbers, particularly after the Civil War. The Transcontinental Railroad, for example, became a technological vehicle for a lot of this to happen. Now, the BAI commissioner named Luke Lake, he declared in 1850 that American Indians should be placed in positions where they could be controlled and finally compelled by stern necessity to resort to agricultural labor or starve, meaning force them to live in a way that was more common with the Western ideas of land use or face starvation. Now, Thomas Fitzpatrick was an Indian agent who helped to negotiate several of these treaties, and he looked and saw this situation of creating these reservations, though, as expensive, vicious, and inhumane. So there was definitely debate on these Indian policies. And we could see during the Civil War some of the conflict, meaning the American Indians feeling that the situation was untenable. Anger turned to violence on the Santee Sioux Reservation, which was in Minnesota. The government official refused to release food that was promised to the Sioux who were starving, who were living on the reservation, and the Sioux attacked the Indian agency in retaliation, and they also attacked nearby farms and towns. And of course, tragedy for the settlers, and of course, the army troops would come in, and they executed 38 Sioux, and the tribe was relocated further west. Now, many Plains Indians refused to live on reservations because of the importance of following the buffalo. And the buffalo, of course, were wild animals that were, we believe there might have been as many as 60 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains, and the American Indians would follow the buffalo and kill them and use pretty much every bit of it, the skins, the bones, the marrow in the bones. Everything was used for American Indians. But as the supply of their food, that is the buffalo, began to be extinct, you could see that like in 1795, buffalo were pretty much gone from Pennsylvania. But as the buffalo populations disappeared, the ability to support American Indians' way of life would also disappear. So the idea was if the white people could exterminate the buffalo, they could in effect remove the Indians who depended on the buffalo to live. So approximately 20,000 United States troops, many were Civil War veterans, this is after 1865, were assigned to confined tribes on their reservations to work as guards. Many African American troops who served in the Civil War would serve alongside whites, or particularly segregated battalions, but they became known as Buffalo Soldiers by the American Indians who they were fighting. Once a group of Indians settled and accepted a territory and a reservation, new settlers would press for more land and a renegotiation of treaties that were supposed to last forever. So we're going to stop at this point and we'll start the next piece. And this was looking at the issue of Sand Creek, and we'll pick up the story of Sand Creek next.